welcome to the next edition of the Value Exchange podcast. I'm Annabelle Lambert and I'm here with my regular co-host Rob Pye. Say hello, Rob Pye.
Hi.
Absolutely delighted today to have as our special guest Mr. Alan Fowler, someone who we have known, I've known we've just worked out the last 25 years. Rob's probably known longer. We were in a close proximity in EY back in the day. But Alan is going to obviously introduce himself, but Alan's all about helping people, organisations and the future, and how, correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but how we can create a better future by imagining it and then working backwards to then move forwards is a summary of how I see a lot of what you're about, which is the most amazing and enlightening exercise when one puts one's brain to it and makes a massive difference. So I'm going to hand over to Alan. Alan, introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself, where you are and what you are about.
Well, thank you very much, Annabelle. And yes, indeed, Rob, Annabelle, I've known you now for, I think it must be close on 30 years, actually, when we go back. I'm presently retired, but my wife wishes I was more retired because I'm pretty active supporting a number of individuals as a mentor, a number of companies as a mentor, and I'm also an associate, a very active associate, in the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is a brand new institute. It's part of the University of Edinburgh, where I live. And perhaps one of the most striking things about it is that it's bought and is redeveloping the old Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, which is a beautiful building in the middle of a beautiful city, in the middle of a beautiful country. And this building has 13 acres of space. Sorry, I can't render that into hectares. And the whole ground floor is shortly to open to the public. And the idea is that people can go in, sit in cafes and talk with academics, talk with entrepreneurs. And some of the big corporates have taken space in there: Aberdeen, Baillie Gifford, NatWest, and there'll be more. And that all of these people mix together with a common interest in designing and delivering futures. So I find that very exciting. I suppose the point of common interest goes back to 1987, 88, when I was working with a colleague in a small and medium company, about 25 people, but we specialized in what were then called structured methods of analysis. We would go into big corporates and analyze how they functioned in a highly structured way. And my colleague David Franks and I became very frustrated with the conventional methods of planning. The whole idea that you sit in the present and try to look forward and then say, well, first we'll do this, then we'll do that, then we'll do the next thing. And meantime, discover an explosion of possibilities and start to encounter completely unforeseeable events, such as COVID happening, such as Ukraine war happening. Relatively unpredictable. You can't plan for all of them. And we find that these big plans that people have go wrong. And I'm presently writing a second book, and the whole first chapter is devoted to the vast cost and the vast failure of large numbers of the world's biggest projects and programs. And we thought, well, we just can't afford this. There must be a better way of designing futures and then making sure they get delivered. So way back then, back in the late 80s, we were toying with this idea, and we were working at the time on an assignment in the Standard Life Assurance Company. We were modeling the way that people in the company did their jobs. doing it for the Financial Services Authority, who needed to be sure that everybody's work in financial companies is documented. I mean, we're using a technique which enabled us to examine not just the sequence of what people do, what we all do. First we do this, then this, then this, but also what was happening simultaneously. While we're doing this, others are doing something else. Yeah, while you sit and watch this, around you, people are doing other things. And that ripples out across the world. And we were able to model what was happening simultaneously. And pretty quickly, we found that the actual outcomes of quite routine procedures, certainly of projects and plans, happened because of interactions with things happening simultaneously. In fact, they were accidental, happenstance. What Paul Simon called in a lyric accidents and incidents. And he talked about angels spinning in infinity. These accidental and incidental cross connections between things have in fact got the dominant impact on what subsequently happens. So the challenge then was, how do you get a grip on this? And David Franks said in one of our conversational sessions, I remember the time and the incident vividly. It was actually in my lounge of my house. He was standing with a whiteboard and he said, of course, we don't know the causes of anything until the outcome has happened. So think hard about that. We don't know the causes of anything until the outcome has happened. So it's not until the post-implementation review of a project, or it's not until the wedding celebration is over, or it's not until your journey is complete that you actually know the sequence of causes that really led to that. And you can see that in that one big insight, he flipped planning on its head. And we turned from looking at forecasting what was going to happen into looking at backcasting what was going to happen from an hypothesized future. Now, if you translate that, you just imagine a journey. Let's say you're setting out from London to travel to Edinburgh, where I live, as I think, Rob, you're going to be doing fairly soon.
I am. Edinburgh Festival, Fringe.
Yeah,
Yep, soon.
absolutely. Very welcome. And what happens when you plan a journey is that you do actually use backcasting. You're absolutely certain of where you're going to arrive. You know what it'll look like when you arrive in Edinburgh pretty well, yeah? And all your family know what to expect and what it looks like. And I'm sure what you do is you start to plan backwards from it. You know when you want to arrive, so you look up a plane that's going to get you there in time, and then you come back to when does that plane leave the airport? And then you think, well, in that case, I've got to be at security by such and such a time. And then you think, well, I'll need to arrive at the airport by this time. So you think, well, what means of transport am I going to use to get to the airport? So when do I need to start that? If it's a taxi, when do I call the taxi for? And that leads you to think about, well, when do we have breakfast? When do we get up in the morning? Yeah. And indeed, going back to the previous day, when do we get packed? Now, we habitually actually plan backwards for anything where we personally, everybody personally, absolutely needs to meet a deadline. Yeah. And because
So
we're
let me
operating, yes, go ahead.
sorry, there's a slight delay. Let me sort of put a tiny provocation in at this point, and then take you back to the why this means so much to you. That original story, almost the sort of the backstory. Now that the outcome is Alan Fowler, currently, looking at the causes. But the slight provocation is that in our learning, I think we were equally frustrated with terrible outcomes. And part of that was a similar frustration, not just in the methodology of planning forward, but just the lack of consideration for outcomes that were people or planet centric. So often we might say, here's a corporate outcome of implementing a new system, and actually the impact with reality along the way, the unintended consequences of that can often cause more damage than good. And often the good intentions of an outcome set up front can be undone through entirely unforeseen, unplanned circumstances. And one of our responses was value exchange, was to really understand the individual incentives and motivation. But another one has been our sort of project management approach, which we sort of very much worship from the altar of Agile Scrum now, rather than Prince 2 or um, any waterfall methodology. And remember, Tony Clark, who's another co-founder, he's sort of like the theorist, the Alan, behind the, getting a bit disaffected with the waterfall methodologies. But Agile Scrum and Action Research says, let's look at a 1, 2, or 3 month horizon for whatever our big outcome, vision, or mission is, and actually look at what we can impact over the next couple of months. And that has been really brilliant, because we take action all the time. We're okay, this is a great thought, but what are we going to do now and today? So that almost the provocation is that you have to kind of have things in your sights that you're going to, what am I going to practically do now? And that has yielded fantastic results. But I want to now take you back to that was a bit of a provocation, because I can tell you're going to go, right, I'm going to talk. But I want to ask why this means so much to you, because as a learned, consultant and academic and individual, you could get motivated by lots of frustrations, let's say, with planning in corporates. But why does it mean so much? You mentor people, you help, you do environmental, you do so many things that are people and planet. Where's the link between that story that was your backstory of the corporate planning frustration and how you signify meaning personally? So this is about you.
Yes, I think once I had got into the frame of mind that constantly thought about the future and futures. If you start to live in the future, there's a chap called Philip Zimbardo. He got some bad press years ago, but he did some very good work on the fact you can divide people up roughly. You can divide them in lots of ways, can't you? But one way you can do it by looking at their speech is to detect people who tend to dwell in the past. They dwell in their memories. Yeah. People who tend to dwell in the present. They tend to be hedonists. They have a good time now, never mind the future. And there are people who dwell in the future. And I became more and more of a future dweller. And I remember once meeting a chap on a train many years ago. He was a regional planner for Northeast England, and he'd come from a meeting in London. Now, this is probably 20, 25 years ago. And the planning meeting had been about, guess what? Global warming. And he said to me, I am frightened as I sit here now by what I have heard. Yeah. And I said, well, what about painting a future which isn't frightening? And in this future, global warming has happened, but now what's going on is that there is a much, much smaller population of human beings, yeah, and they're living in a circle round the North Pole because that's where the land masses are. And those are the areas that have remained temperate. In fact, they're a good deal more fertile than they are at present because they've warmed up. And actually, just imagine that that's a situation you quite like, that there are people living there and they're happier and they're having a quite a nice life and it's working. Of course, it predicates there are far, far fewer human beings on Earth. Of course, that raises severe worries about how that happened. How did the population decline? And of course, back in those days, we thought global warming would happen much more slowly than it turns out it's happening. So there was more time to adapt. But you could paint a picture and you could see his brow clearing of a long-term future, which actually was not such an apocalyptic view.
Out of control, yeah.
It's back in control.
And I'm probably just to interrupt, because I may be drawing some dots that others watching may not join. So I can see, knowing you, how that future in People and Planet bit, the future thinking makes it really real for you in terms of meaning. But if I am in the now, if I'm watching this and go, yeah, but I'm too busy. I'm doing my shopping. I'm gotten a job. I don't. This is all great. Alan is a genius, and there are few people who could spend time with Alan's thought process. There are not many of them. How can somebody think about the future if they're living in the now? How can they just take a moment to reflect? Any advice or thought? Because most of us, we live in the now, don't we? I'm afraid I've got my washing to do. I've got Tesco's at the door. How can any advice in your journey of how to help people just take one day forward in their mind?
Well, there are times actually when we all have to think in the future. If tend to be crises in life, we're going to move house, for example, or get married, or indeed die.
Go on holiday. Like
a holiday. There are times when we actually are obliged to think into the future. Yeah. And something that I often put to my mentees as a first question on first meeting them is, who do you want to be when you're 65? What do you want people to be saying about you? Kindly, thoughtful person, happy person, yeah, somebody I like knowing because, and start to describe that future, yeah, paint a picture of it in your mind, talk about it with other people. A very useful tool I've found to do that is to resuscitate Maslow's old hierarchy of needs. I'm sure many people have come across that, 1954, Abraham Maslow. And go through the pyramid, start at the top, self-actualization. What would that look like for you? I meet people, I maybe meet people who know you, and they say about you that you are kind, thoughtful, interested in people, whatever. What would you like them to say about you? And then next level down, what have you accomplished? Show me, walk me around your accomplishments. Rob, show me ethos. Yeah, Annabelle, show me ethos. Show me Team Army. Show me what you're proud of. What are your accomplishments? Yeah, and then maybe look at the personal relations. The belonging bit. Maybe I speak with your friends and relations, and they speak lovingly of you. What do you want them to be saying? And then maybe you show me the attitudes and skills and measures that you've taken that make you resilient in the face of change, that give you security and safety. Yeah. And then maybe you show me the assets you've gathered, the learning, the qualifications, the skills, the investments, the property that enable you to meet your family's needs. And paint a picture then of who you want to be. Yeah. How you want to be known. And from that, you can start to work back with your personal future and work out how that would have come about. Now, the really interesting thing to me is that no, I am not busy about everyday things. Yeah. More and more and more, I've realized that the world around me is like a great field of dominoes standing up that other people have put up on end with their effort, their investment, and their money. And what I have to do is I have to look around that field of dominoes and say, looking at where I want to arrive at and working backwards from it, I need to tip that domino over, that one over, that one over, and that one over, and they will knock lots of other dominoes over and lead to what I want to get to. So you get less and less busy with everyday things and more as you get older, thinking about what move to make that will cause the outcomes that you want. When I was younger, I was full of physical energy. I did everything the hard way. Yeah,
I can
I raced.
attest. I can attest to that. Never
Yeah,
met anyone with more energy, and still hugely
well,
energetic. But
as you get older, you don't have that energy anymore, and you have to start using your brain. Yeah, you have to start looking around and saying, what are other people doing where I can put one and two together and make three or even four out of it? Yeah. And I put it to you that that's what ethos is doing. That's partly why it's working. Yeah. You're putting together the work that other people have done and getting it to tumble over in the end direction that you want.
well,
The
it's quite. What was quite interesting is that over 15 years of doing thousands of value exchange, and in your honour, there is an experimental section 6 in it, which is backcasting, and it is all about developing our practice for future backwards thinking, which has always been about ethos, valuable outcomes, but um, the the individual focus is about how do we collaborate with individuals to achieve outcomes that are going to be good for it for as many people as possible. So it has never been about Rob and Annabelle and Tony or employees of Ethos. It's always been about who are we going to collaborate with. And part interesting of what we've just been through that maybe you have a comment on is that where we're going now has involved a lot of undoing of the spinning out ventures of team police, of smart cities, of ethos wilder sensing, on and on and on, because you kind of collect a legacy that you're rather like a banking system with million lines of COBOL code, and we've in order to be fresh and and give attention to those dominoes you talk about, we've had to ensure that we're not carrying a big
yeah,
legacy that is making us ineffective. And we after 15 years have had to clear out our attic in order to be fresh enough to then take. That's part of this series, 24, 25 episodes of regenerating our messages.
so can I do a provocation back? How do you know what to throw out of your attic?
Well, Annabelle will tell you that that my sort of DNA starts with everything, and when we when we started Ethos the second time, so originally in 1999 2000, but then again in 2010, um, and now again in 2023, the the blank sheet of paper is if there was nothing and we had to rebuild from scratch, what do we now want to put on that blank sheet of paper? Because
Yeah,
we know that individual agendas, interests, values, meaning, have to be central to what is right about the future, and what is wrong about the future. And if we know also that trust, collaboration, moderation of interests, and alignment are behaviors that we really want to engender, it means that when we meet someone who's absolutely passionate about an approach like D4, the onus is on us to find a way to work with the everyone, really, because if we can't do it, how can we
yeah.
expect other people to do
So
it?
can I just highlight something quickly there before we lose it? You made a list of qualities, yeah, that you want to see happening in the future. Yeah.
Mhm.
That in my book is you start or you defining the future you want to get to. And as you rightly point out, that enables you to discard the things that don't fit with that future.
Mm-hmm.
Can I talk briefly about sat nav? as an analogy because we're all very familiar with them. Yeah, you've got one in your car, you've got one on your smartphone. Yep. Think about it. When you set a destination in the sat nav, it then plans the route backwards to where you are at present. And you can tell that that's happening because if something gets in the way and frustrates you and stops you getting to that destination, and you diverge from that route, your sat nav goes right back to the destination and replans it, doesn't it? Yeah. That is the process that a backcast planning person is doing all the time. And when you talk about clearing stuff out of the attic, what you're doing is clearing redundant routes out of your attic. And the closer you get to your destination, the fewer of those redundant routes there are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many ways to help. And we refer to a North Star, rather than a sort of a sat nav analogy. And part of who you are is we start with getting. You talk about looking back, looking now, looking forward. We help people to understand a little bit about who they are by asking them to recount a story which is a looking back story, normally in the immediate past, but in your case there was that 1980s story, why you started on that journey quite a few months ago. And then the sort of the North Star for us is a bit about what change do you want to see in the world, or your mission statement, or it's sort of section 2 of these things that we kind of we focus on. But that is never an outcome, but it is a behavioural set of, if things are like this, I'm unhappy. If they're like that, they're not. So your Maslow's analogy was a great one, because it is about looking at what kind of future you would like to play a part in, and that if you're doing things that don't contribute to that or do contribute to that, then that is the sat nav. So that North Star isn't an outcome. And then we would have something about outcomes, deliverables, and relationships. And the relationship bit is absolute, because in what we're doing, we don't model the world as an organizational, which are rather these ephemeral things that they kind of come and go. But at the end of the day, without individuals, at some point in history, we wouldn't have any organizational form. So we don't really recognize organization as an organic or some construct that is anything other than some people and some context. It's not a thing. Even the United Nations or the United Kingdom, it's just a mechanism of organizing. And the backcast to me is rather like Agile Scrum, in that how can I really get from A to B? Where is that A to B now? And whatever the rest of the stuff we've talked about is not like Agile Scrum or Prince, or these are just organizing principles. How you actually get through the water is more, where you are, rather than what is the water you'd like to swim in. You're kind of looking at the context with value exchange, rather than the process of how you get there. That's a bit geeky and academic for people who might be looking at this and go, wow, but
would it be fair to say that you're as interested in what the journey is like as you are in the destination?
Yes.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Now, this is interesting. What if I said to you that what the journey is like, could also be labelled an outcome, something desirable, something you want to happen? Yeah. I know it's not the end of the journey, but it's still an outcome. Now, a number of the outcomes we've applied these principles, by the way, to the design and delivery of the future of the Edinburgh Futures Institute, would you believe? Yeah. And a number of these outcomes, which we call recognition events, because they're events that you can recognize, have already happened. Now, the period of the forecast is 10 years. It ends in 2031, actually, 2031, 32. Most of the things which will characterize the Edinburgh Futures Institute as people want it to be have already happened. Sometimes only in one or two places, sometimes extensively across the whole thing. Sometime in September, the building will start to open. That is a big, what we call tipping point, because once that happens, a whole lot of other things will flow from it. It's the last flake of snow that sends the avalanche down the mountainside. People might have read Malcolm Gladwell, Tipping Point. Yeah. So these things that characterize what you want the journey to be like are themselves, or could be, framed as outcomes. Yeah, you may not want to use that word of them.
Well, I think we do use that word. We have a destination, which is not it's never a final destination. It's where am I going to next? You know, where am I going next? And then we go, well, what is our commitment? You know, to get there. What are the outcomes we're going to work towards? You know,
and I just I forget how influential you've been, Alan, in my life, in that we, every 1 to 3 months, a sort of serial value recognition, practitioner has a value recognition event, which is simply their story and their collaborators' story of recognizing not an outcome, but the social, environmental, the people, what has their journey been? How are they living? How are they experiencing the journey? And that is a reflective, moment where it's hugely valuable for people on the journey to kind of go, look, this is where I am now. And that is really, the value exchange is about the journey.
Do you know, Rob, one of the biggest difficulties applying this in big corporates has been getting people to get up and go and look and see whether they can recognize this thing happening or not. It's quite difficult to persuade people to look, to inspect, and to recognize. Can I, looking at the clock ticking, I want to just touch on to something that people might find very unexpected. In applying this approach, we list these outcomes, these recognition events, with dates when we're going to go and look and expect to see them happening. We then take the chart of accounts, the financial chart of accounts of the organization, or if you're applying it personally, it could be your list of your domestic expenditures and incomes and so forth. Yeah. And we cross-reference each of these outcomes, these recognition events, with that list of heads of asset value, revenues, and costs. And we ask, if and when we achieve this thing, will it increase the value of our assets? Will it increase our revenues, our incomes? And could it reduce our costs? And we derive another list, a list of things that we call, here's the second jargon phrase, value flashpoints, points at which actual cash, as opposed to qualitative values being reflected in the recognition events, cash values will hit the accounts of the organization or of my domestic circumstances. And then we estimate each one, every one of them, no matter how qualitative they may feel, using what's called a Fermi approach to estimating. We estimate the highest possible value it could have, the lowest value it could have, our best finger in the air guess, and then we moderate that for risk. And we end up being able to put a cash value on each of those qualitative or substantive evidential outcomes. Now, money is never an object or it oughtn't to be, what a miserable life you would lead if you only want to make money for money's sake. But money is an enabler. It's a fundamental enabler. There's not a lot you can achieve without that money to enable it to happen. And what this process does is to enable you to see what it's worth in cash value terms, attaining these often very qualitative and subjective outcomes, and thereby to be able to judge how much of the stuff in your attic you can throw out and write off as sunk cost, because it's worth throwing it out, even though you're sinking cost, because look, here's the value of doing it. And it enables you to see how on the road to achieving the outcome, you're actually generating the money you need to fund it. Here's something very counterintuitive. We've done 20, 30 big exercises like this in the last 20 or 30 years. And time and again, the cash flow that turns out has the cash values coming in ahead of the costs of attaining them. That sounds completely impossible, but I assure you it emerged as a result of doing the case studies. It's not what we predicted, it's what we have observed happens. That so often what people thought was a vast funding gap was not a vast funding gap at all. Yeah. Money was not, in fact, the obstacle. I've just had a very interesting discussion, which I can't say too much about for various reasons, about the nature of the funding of the NHS. We all are familiar with the fact that yes, the NHS is desperately underfunded. There is a radically different way of doing that, which emerges from applying this thinking. Yeah. I just am crossing my fingers that that changes in the way
Well,
that
because we've done so much in public service, NHS conversations with chief execs and trusts. It's different in Scotland. It's more central, rather than individual trusts, isn't it? But staff well-being is such a huge issue, and of course the link between that and money. And we have, again, value exchange has something, a financial section. How are you going to fund this? Because unless you put the finances in a concrete section that kind of goes, well, okay, this is how it's going to happen for 3 months, for 6 months, then you can get focused on the wrong thing. It's so important.
You can. You don't want to focus on the money. In fact, we specifically exclude any mention of numbers from recognition events. Absolutely.
Yeah, so do we.
Exclude.
Yeah, no, I was interested to explore that further, because I feel that's everybody's the big error I think in the world is that we're always focused on the money and we forget the outcomes we're trying to achieve. I mean, that's a sweeping statement, of course, and it's not as simple as that, but it feels like that often, that everybody's just concentrating on the money. And of course, I'm very much don't want to concentrate on the money, but I don't want to ignore it either. It's very important not to ignore it for all the reasons that you both said. But it's a challenge in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the case studies we've done suggest it's rather too readily used as an excuse for being unable to do things. I must immediately say that, of course, it's a reason why we can't do things quite often. Of course it is. But we're a little bit too hasty to say the problem is we can't get the funding. Quite often it's a question of looking at, let me go back to the dominoes. Dominoes, someone else has stood up and funded already, which actually we can use to achieve the outcomes we want to use.
But I think, as well as the dominoes, if the dominoes represent individuals rather than institutions, we found them much easier to work with than looking at trying to just institutionally partner, because the motivations for change, the real intrinsic motivation for change, have got to be that somebody says, look, we we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. There's another podcast from a genius, another genius called Guy Standing, who's a professor Oxbridge, absolutely, wonderful commoner, author, but actually his real intrinsic motivation is on basic income. And if you hear him argue the case for it, it's not a business case. In fact, it's simply the right thing to do. And if you hear the passion,
income.
yes, yes, exactly. And it's been his life's sort of purpose, if you like, but kind of removing the disadvantage gap. And so many of the changes we've achieved, in fact, all of them, whether we've achieved it or not, everything has been about, have we aligned with a domino whose DNA is that this is just, they believe it's the right thing to do,
Yeah. So it's often a question of challenging and looking at the world not so much like a chess game, but as this field of dominoes, and saying, well, what is already happening that we can align with and work with and encourage that actually produces the outcomes that we want. So we're always looking at other people's agendas, other companies' agendas, individuals, companies, organizations, charities, governments. What are they wanting to do? And how can we bring those things into alignment to produce the outcome that we want to have? And of course, that does beg the question of who's we? Whose future is it? And this is a really important question. And we've had a little exchange of things in email about this, Rob, haven't we? We found when we started using these methods initially in companies that we had to ask the question, who is paying? Who's the if who pays the piper calls the tune? So who is paying the piper? And really, they're the people who should call the tune. So you start to find in companies that's investors, funders, philanthropists, maybe. But very importantly, it's the customer who is paying. Yeah. And then we began to say, but we're all customers as taxpayers, aren't we? We pay money in taxes and expect to get services for it. Yeah, we're all customers as taxpayers. And it became quite clear that if you ask who is paying, you start to democratize the future. All right, and that's very important.
Interesting.
Because if I took somebody, how can I do this sensitively? Somebody like Pol Pot and say, well, everybody disapproves of Pol Pot, right? And if I went to him and said, what future do you want? We don't want to equip him with this method and approach, which, by the way, has got the nickname D4 of doing things, because we don't want him to succeed, yeah? But actually what we want to do is to look at his population, who are actually the people who are paying here, and say, well, what do you want? Now, we can't ask 66 million people what they like individually. So we have this pretty clumsy and partially effective system called democracy, but it produces a rough gist of what the population is after. So we say the people to ask, what do you want the future to be like? What recognition events do you want to see? Are the investors, the customers, the taxpayers, the funders, in their role as people who are paying. Yeah. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to wrap in that money engine to the whole delivery of the future. Yeah.
I want to just throw a provocation, because I think we need to be very careful with that conflation between money and outcomes and building better futures. So an example of that has come between your email this morning and something that annoyed me a little bit is, sometimes the enormous concentration of money and power can lead to futures that are being paid for not in democratic ways, as you rightly articulate well, in our flawed democratic, but nevertheless, attempts at
Best
democratic,
we've got. Yeah.
best we got.
So far.
But where power and money is concentrated unduly in the hands of relatively tiny amounts of people. So there is a whole debate at the moment about AI and the generative AI, the robots are coming, and this singularity of connectivity and processing power is going to create a future that will be determined not by humanity but by artificial intelligence. And the geniuses are really struggling with how to train how to train this emergent singularity of genius to build a future that actually has humanity even in the script, because actually all evidence points to the fact that we're not very good for the earth and sustainability. Get rid of all of us and that would be easier. So in an attempt to do something which is not geopolitically easy to do, through policy, because we don't know how to legislate for this emergent thing. OpenAI are investing 20% of their processing power into how to align future generative AI to something that we, about that word we, would want. Now, my question and provocation is, who is we? Because OpenAI is populated by super intelligent human beings who are all about AI, and the world that they look at, whether that is neoliberal or capitalistic or whatever, is not democratically represented. It's like the BBC, or it's like whatever. It's like, who is we is such an important question. So I'm afraid it's a bit of a soapbox, but I think this who pays the piper and the money is central, because a world that serves people and planet is not an obvious one that would align to where money and power is at the moment, in my contention.
I think maybe the trick is that old phrase, follow the money. Look at the money, the vast amounts of money owned by, say, Microsoft or Google, or pretty soon by OpenAI and whoever owns them, and track where it comes from. Yeah. And where it comes from is customers, of course. Yeah. And if customers rebel, and you could see that happening in Twitter, very good example at the moment, then the source of money folds up. And I think it is up to people, humans, who perceive the risks of AI to rebel. Yeah, to say, no, I won't. No, I won't deal with this company exclusively online. I won't do it. You must deal with me face to face, or I'm not a customer of yours anymore. Yeah. And it's the old story that if these big movements cannot carry populations with them, then they don't survive. They wither away. So it's a question, I think, of people understanding the customer power, the population power. And what is the real challenge with AI, to my mind, is that should happen, that the population should express its views through its customer behavior and where it directs its money faster than AI can become its own customer. Yeah. The risk from the point of view of humankind is that AI doesn't need humans anymore. It becomes able to build itself, replicate itself, evolve for itself. For the rest of Earth, that might be really good news, because, as you pointed out, humans have scarcely done the Earth any favors, and actually are at risk now of demolishing it. But if we want to survive, then we've got to sometimes rebel, and rebel not just through the ballot box, but through our wallets, through what we buy, and for whom we choose to be customers. And that's
Yeah, I
what
mean, I
I've.
think that there's a huge issue, and I apologise for sort of throwing it in there, but it is
Oh, good.
it's just it's impossible. It's an impossible discussion, really.
So this piper, this who pays? We need to remember that we pay. That is to say, billions of people around the world pay. We are the big source of money, and all of these accumulations of money that sit with very wealthy individuals and very wealthy companies exist only at our discretion. Yeah, if we cease to provide the money to them, it disappears. Yeah, as a pool. And I think that this whole process, planning backwards, this what is nicknamed D4, highlights all of that time and again in its case studies, and brings it out, which is why I'm so enthusiastic about it. You can understand.
And for the individual who is trying to get to terms with a lot of what we're saying here, stories about how when you've introduced this in organizations, how tips or tricks, stories of somebody who hasn't really done this as they're a Prince practitioner, they are project management, here we go, right, I'm planning my 3-year project, here's the Gantt chart, here's the project document, right, here we go. A lot of government planning is still in that mindset that we see of current forward. How does it go down when you work with individuals? What is there resistance?
Well,
Do
it
people
goes
get
down.
it?
It goes down very badly with people who are highly experienced program and project managers, and steeped in that world. It goes down extremely well with the board and investors because we're talking their language. It goes down well with customers. And a number of times we've ended up doing a D4 style exercise on the company simultaneously with a Prince PPM style exercise going on. I was working in Scottish office as it then was before the days of Prince, and Learmonth and Birchett, an American pair, brought in this method called prompt, which was adopted by the Treasury in the UK, and they had a couple of trial projects using it in London, and they had a trial project, my one, using it in Scotland. It was the replacement of the NHS pension system. Prompt was absolutely brilliant as a project management method. Half-hour meetings. The key sponsor had to be at pretty well every meeting. Decisions were taken very rapidly, very ruthlessly. Sunk cost was written off. People were brutally honest about the purpose of building these systems and these projects. And then Prompt was purchased by the Central Computer and Telecommunications Agency, who started to produce Prince. Prince, to me, is elephantine. It's lost all track of its purpose, and above all, it's created layers and layers of governance, so that the project program and its governance have become an industry rather than the purpose of doing the project in the first place. Now, D4 is the absolute contradiction of that. It's the inverse of all of that. It says, no, it's the customer, it's the investor, it's the taxpayer whose needs are paramount, and it's whatever is the smartest route to delivering those needs. Yeah, it is not about creating another project management method, another governance system, another industry. It's very,
and you get when you unpick what you've just said, you get down to whose interests are you protecting when you you create a bureaucracy that serves itself, is self-licking. And I think that by uncovering the interests, you can see that, again, with Agile Scrum, where you've got a very naked governance system with a product owner who represents a group of customers who want to do one thing. They want like a little red button over there. And actually, when you kind of strip it down to how do we just get on and deliver that button, rather than we just do governance for a living, when there's nothing to govern other than the mechanism of governance itself. If you ask yourself where are the self-interests that look to keep all the bureaucracies box ticking, I think there are lots of answers there. And again, it's about whose interests are we serving. The idea that consultants, for example, make a living out of having all these boxes. It's not, it's not obvious.
Mea culpa. I have made a living out of this. And mea culpa for huge amounts of things. It fascinates me. No doubt somewhere in my ancestry, people were slavers. Mea culpa. We are all responsible for these awful things. I see the time is ticking on.
Yeah, it is.
To wind up.
It is indeed.
So yeah, do you want to give us a summary, Annabelle, of a sort of reflection on the conversation this morning? Just some final words.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, the money is always a contention, and I think the interesting to hear from you, Alan, about the challenges when you taking these ideas and where they land and where they don't land. And I feel for me I want people to be thinking more of the future. I want them to be innovating and imagining more what can happen without feeling challenged by the, that always we can't possibly find the money to do that. That's not an excuse. I feel I want to knock that one down every time it gets in my way because I'm not interested. I think you can work that out subsequently, but you can make things happen in that way. But I'm interested to know whether I'm a future dweller or not. I want to have my
study your language.
Yeah, my language studied. But I mean, I feel very aligned with a lot of what we've discussed, with what we're doing with value exchange, with getting people to have their moments of value recognition, which is, your reflection points of what have we achieved. And it doesn't matter whether it marries with what you said you were going to achieve. It's what have you achieved? What are the outcomes that have happened on your pathway? And then what are you going to do next about that? What's the next 3-month journey? Where am I going? How am I going to get to Edinburgh in the next 3 months? What does that mean? And then working that backwards in as you describe, I feel is what we do all the time. That's very much part of the process. And then, as Rob said, the backcasting stuff is a new and additional and experimental thing that we're embarking on. But already, talk to people about it. It was well received, and it's just about getting your head in that space of, well, actually, this is, just again a shift of mindset as to how I might get to a better future by engaging my brain in this different way. So thank you, Alan, for all that. Is there anything, Rob, that you want to say that I've missed?
Well, I just want to thank Alan, wish him all the best with his new book, and invite him back when he wants to publicise it. I've always known, Alan, that you were a fellow traveller. And back to our bit of the future, we're 25 podcasts or whatever into this. We're inviting people, and it, one of the people that starred, his words were the future is hiding in plain sight. Yeah. Those dominoes. You've always been a fellow traveller. actually everybody, if you unpick it, somewhere in their DNA is a fellow traveller. You just need to give them permission to come to the show and engage in it. But it's finding and talking to everyone and realizing that we're all trying to do the same thing. And it's not, D4 versus value exchange. It's all the same thing. We all want,
Yes, it
really,
is.
when you unpick
It
it,
is.
we don't want
This-
to blow up the world. Surely. Do we? Do we really want to end the world? It's like, no, there must be a better future. So thank you and final words to you then, Alan.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, people who watch this, for having the patience to watch it. There's quite some other big interesting aspects to this. There's a whole podcast one could do on the science, the physics of causality behind D4. And of course, we could explain how it works in corporates more thoroughly. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope to speak with you again.
Until next time,
Thank
away.
you. Bye. Bye.